Today's episode, I am sharing 9 true Dollar Tree horror stories. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I still remember that afternoon, though I wish I didn't. It was just a quick trip to Dollar Tree, something mindless, something to fill a dull Saturday. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just a few cleaning supplies and maybe a snack or two. The parking lot was half empty, the sun lazily drifting across the sky like it had nothing better to do. Even at the time, there was this odd quiet, almost too quiet. No cars moving, no distant chatter, just the faint hum of the store's sign buzzing overhead. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the fluorescent lights. They were brighter than usual, casting stark, cold shadows that made the rows of shelves feel endless. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I'd just had too much coffee that morning. But as I walked in, a sense of wrongness, subtle at first, crept over me. I passed the first aisle, the snacks section, and noticed that the shelves seemed taller than normal, packed tighter than they should have been. I shook my head, blaming the tiredness and the coffee jitters. I grabbed a small basket and started walking, weaving between aisles. Then, for the first time, it hit me. The layout felt off. Every aisle I passed seemed familiar, but not in a comforting way. It was like seeing a friend's face in a dream, recognizable, but something was missing. I turned down what I thought was aisle 4, only to realize I was back at the candy section. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was impossible. I had entered from the main doors, walked straight past the cleaning supplies, yet here I was again, staring at the same display of chocolate bars. I paused, listening. There was the faint sound of cartwheels squeaking somewhere behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. No employees, no other customers, just me and the aisles stretching further than they should. I started walking again, slower this time, almost hesitant. Each aisle I passed seemed identical to the last, yet somehow different. A shelf here was crooked, a price tag there was slightly torn. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a tight knot of panic building in my chest. My hands shook slightly as I gripped the basket, and I realized I had started whispering to myself, just to hear a human voice. By the time I reached the end of the row, I felt watched, not in the someone's looking at me way, but in a more primal, unsettling sense. Something unseen was aware of me, following, shifting with my steps. I thought about leaving, about sprinting to the front doors, but the aisles stretched endlessly, like the store had grown while I wasn't looking. My pulse was racing, my chest tight, but my legs moved on, drawn forward by some compulsion I didn't understand. Even now, thinking back, I can feel the fluorescent glare in my eyes, the unnatural stillness in the air, and that creeping dread. The sense that Dollar Tree was no longer just a store. It had become something else, something that didn't want me to leave. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd wandered into a weirdly rearranged section of the store. But the moment I stepped into the next aisle, that thought crumbled. The lights flickered briefly overhead, casting strange, uneven shadows across the shelves. I could swear I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, something, or someone, slipping just past the aisle's edge. When I turned fully, nothing was there. I kept walking, slower this time, every step careful, my basket shaking in my grip. The products around me seemed off. The colors were slightly too vivid, the labels slightly misprinted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made me feel like I had stepped into a version of reality that wasn't quite mine. I passed the cleaning supplies aisle again, definitely the same aisle from 10 minutes ago, but the labels on the bottles had changed. One read sparkle clean, the next shimmer fresh. I didn't remember any of that before. My stomach churned. Then came the sound, low at first, almost a whisper beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights. A soft dragging, like a cart scraping across the linoleum somewhere far ahead. I froze, straining to hear. It moved closer, echoing through the aisles in a way that made my chest tighten. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my legs betrayed me, moving forward anyway. The dragging stopped suddenly, leaving only the faint hum of the store lights. I reached what I thought was the end of the row and stopped dead. There, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall, unnervingly thin, and dressed in the store's uniform, but wrong. Its posture was too rigid, too deliberate, and it didn't blink. I blinked at it, thinking maybe I was hallucinating, but it didn't move. Every instinct in my body screamed that I shouldn't look away, that I shouldn't breathe too loudly. My heart was palpitating. When I finally stumbled out of the store, somehow finding the doors that had seemed to shift endlessly, I felt like I was leaving more than just a building behind. My hands were trembling, my legs weak, and my chest felt like it was being crushed by some invisible weight. I didn't immediately notice the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the parking lot that didn't match the time I'd come in. Everything felt wrong. Even the air outside seemed heavier, thicker, almost tainted by the lingering dread from inside. I kept replaying the aisles in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I had walked in circles without realizing it. Maybe the flickering lights and strange labels were tricks of fatigue or caffeine. But the memory of that figure, motionless, impossibly thin, staring without blinking, refused to let me settle on any logical explanation. My rational brain screamed it was impossible, but my body and instincts refused to believe a word of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that store, wandering aisle after aisle with no escape. The fluorescent hum would echo in my ears, and the dragging sound would creep up from nowhere, always just behind me, never quite letting me rest. I checked my phone repeatedly, imagining some missed notification or hidden app was somehow recording me, tracking me. But of course, nothing was there. The paranoia clung to me like a second skin. Even days later, the fear hadn't fully subsided. Walking past convenience stores or grocery chains now triggered a low, simmering anxiety. The aisles felt narrower, the lights harsher. I would sometimes glance over my shoulder in those stores, expecting to see that same figure watching me, frozen and unblinking. I even avoided Dollar Tree for weeks, telling myself I was being silly, that it had been a weird, one-off experience. But the knot in my chest never loosened. The dread lingered, subtle but insistent, like a shadow just beyond perception. The strangest part is how normal everything seemed on the surface. Friends and coworkers laughed when I tried to describe it, nodding politely while thinking I was exaggerating. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen, and that certainty made it impossible to ignore. Even now, when I walk past that location, I feel the pull of those endless aisles, the silent weight of being watched. I can't explain it. I can't rationalize it. And maybe that's what's worse, the lingering knowledge that some places, some experiences, aren't meant to make sense. Sometimes I wonder if it was just a trick of my mind, or if the store itself had changed. If it waits for the next person to wander in, promising cheap deals and leaving only confusion, dread, and the creeping terror of aisles that never end. I'll never step inside without feeling that same quiet, gnawing fear. And deep down, I don't think I want to. It started as a routine trip, the kind where I tell myself I'm just going in for one thing and somehow end up wandering every aisle. That day I was hunting for discounted household items, mostly small things I didn't really need. Cleaning sponges, cheap candles, maybe a bag of chips to keep me company while binge-watching a show later. Dollar Tree had always felt ordinary to me. Nothing special, nothing memorable. But that day, something about the store was off. I noticed it almost immediately when I reached the clearance section near the back. The lights flickered more than usual, casting uneven shadows across the stacks of half-price items. It was late afternoon, so the store wasn't crowded, just a few scattered shoppers drifting aimlessly. But there was an odd hush, the kind that made every footstep echo unnaturally loud. I reached for a set of discount dish towels, and that's where. And I first heard it, a faint whisper, almost beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights. I froze, my fingers still on the plastic-wrapped towels. At first I thought it was someone behind me, maybe a kid giggling or someone on their phone, but when I turned, the aisle was empty. The whispers stopped for a moment, replaced by a sudden, almost tangible silence. My chest tightened, a pit forming in my stomach. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was my imagination, tired eyes playing tricks. But then it started again, soft and almost melodic, just at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't words, not really, just murmurs, fragments of phrases that felt like they were trying to speak directly to me. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around the clearance rack. Everything looked normal, or as normal as a pile of cheap household items could be, but there was an unease about it that I couldn't name. I could feel the air around me thicken, every inhale heavy, every small noise amplified. My heart began to race, and my palms grew clammy as I realized I was standing alone, staring at a rack of discounted trinkets that should have been completely ordinary. Even then, I couldn't turn away. I couldn't stop looking. Something about that clearance rack was magnetic, like it was calling me closer. Every instinct screamed to step back, to leave the aisle and go about my day, but my legs betrayed me. I inched closer, my eyes scanning the small toys, cheap gadgets, and random knickknacks stacked haphazardly. And as I did, the whispers became clearer, almost coaxing, almost knowing. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down, nudging me into focus, making me hyper-aware of every creak of the shelves, every faint clatter of a product shifting just slightly, as if someone, or something, was adjusting it when I wasn't looking. I remember thinking, halfway between disbelief and fear, that this was impossible. Dollar Tree had never been like this, and yet standing there, alone in that half-lit corner, I knew that something had changed, something was waiting, and whatever it was aware of me. I couldn't stop staring at that clearance rack. Every item seemed to shimmer slightly in the flickering fluorescent lights, as if the cheap plastic and cardboard were alive in some subtle, impossible way. The whispers grew louder, but still incoherent, fragments of words I couldn't quite grasp, like someone muttering behind a thick wall. My chest tightened with every step closer, my fingers brushing the edges of toys and gadgets that suddenly felt too heavy, too solid, as if they were holding on to something unseen. Then I heard it clearly, not a whisper this time, but a voice, low, deliberate, almost inside my head rather than in the room. "Look, closer," it said. I spun around, heart pounding, expecting someone to be there, a stranger hiding in the shadows of the aisle, but there was nothing. The store was empty, silent except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional distant squeak of a shopping cart. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the beginnings of a sweat forming on my forehead. I reached out toward a small, brightly colored toy, a dollar item, nothing remarkable, and as my fingers touched it, a cold shock ran up my arm. My skin prickled, hair standing on end, and I yanked my hand back as if burned. The whispers intensified, surrounding me, echoing off the shelves, coming from all directions. I spun in a circle, my basket rattling against the metal shelves, trying to locate the source, but the sound was impossible to trace. Every direction seemed to carry the same eerie murmuring, like the rack itself was breathing, alive and aware of my presence. Panic started clawing at my chest. I wanted to leave, to run out into the fluorescent sunlight of the parking lot, but my legs felt heavy, uncooperative, rooted to the spot. I watched in disbelief as one of the tiny toys shifted on its own, a doll leaning slightly forward, a plastic ball rolling half an inch across the shelf, as if moved by invisible hands. My stomach churned violently. This wasn't normal. I knew it. I could see it. I could feel it. And then I heard laughter, not loud, not joyful, soft, sinister, barely a breath, but unmistakably there. It echoed behind the clearance rack, somewhere too close for comfort. My heart hammered, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my basket, desperate to escape. But as I turned to flee, I realized something horrifying. The aisle I had come from, the familiar path to the front of the store, was gone. In its place was another aisle, identical to the one I was in, stocked with the same cluttered items, the same flickering lights, and the same whispers. I stood there, paralyzed, every rational thought drowned by dread. The store had shifted. It wasn't the Dollar Tree I knew anymore. It was some twisted version of it, endless, alive, and somehow aware of me. The whispers wrapped around my mind, coaxing, teasing, filling the space between each heartbeat with fear I couldn't escape. And for the first time that day, I realized I might not get out. When I finally tore myself away from that clearance rack, I felt like I had left a part of my sanity behind. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely carry my basket, and my stomach churned as if I had swallowed something sour and bitter at the same time. I didn't dare glance back at the aisle, even though a part of me ached with a morbid curiosity to see if it would shift, if the whispers would continue once I stopped moving. I kept walking, more out of instinct than any coherent plan, until I reached the front of the store, the doors that should have led me outside. The moment I stepped into the sunlight, the whispers stopped. Just like that, silence. My chest heaved, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to steady my breathing. The world outside felt impossibly normal, the parking lot buzzing with cars, distant voices from the street, but inside me something had changed. That soft, mocking murmur of voices still clung to my mind, a faint echo I couldn't shake. Every discount item, every toy I had touched felt heavier now, imbued with something unseen, something that had imprinted itself on my thoughts and nerves. For days afterward, I couldn't stop replaying the event in my head. I would imagine the whispers growing louder when I was alone at home, the soft coaxing echoing between my walls. I avoided the clearance sections of any store I went into, yet I couldn't rid myself of the mental image of that aisle, the flickering lights, the subtle shifts of the items, the knowing presence behind them. It wasn't just fear, it was paranoia, an invasive sense that I had been marked in some way, watched in ways I couldn't comprehend. Even my friends noticed the change. I became jumpy, hesitant in ways I hadn't been before. They laughed when I tried to describe the whispers, the feeling that the clearance rack had been alive, aware of me. "Dollar Tree?" one of them said, chuckling. "It's a store, not a haunted house." But I knew what I had felt. I knew that something had happened, something beyond explanation, something that left a residue on my mind I couldn't erase. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear those murmurs faintly again, almost imperceptibly, as if carried by the wind or the hum of the city. And every time I think about returning to Dollar Tree, even just for a simple shopping trip, I feel that same knot in my chest, that quiet, gnawing fear, reminding me that some places aren't just stores. Some places watch, some places wait, and some, I think, whisper secrets that no one is meant to hear. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another Dollar Tree trip, the kind where I wander through the aisles looking for bargains, telling myself I'll only pick up what I actually need, and yet somehow leaving with a basket full of things I'll probably never use. That day, I was scanning the shelves for cleaning supplies, some cheap snacks, and maybe a small decorative candle for my apartment. Everything seemed normal, familiar, even mundane, until I spotted it. It was a tiny, inconspicuous item, something I would have normally overlooked. A small plastic figurine, nothing remarkable, priced at $1 like everything else. But there was something about the tag, something almost glaring. Not in color or font, but in the way it felt, almost like it was insisting I pick it up, demanding attention. I hesitated, laughing nervously at myself. "It's just $1, I muttered under my breath. "What's the harm?" I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, surprisingly heavy for its size. That's when the unease began. The store around me seemed to dim slightly, as if the fluorescent lights had softened just in that small corner. I could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights change pitch, like a subtle vibration in the air that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the aisles were empty, just me and the faint hum of the air. Conditioning. I tried to shake it off, placing the figurine back on the shelf, but my fingers refused to let go. It felt sticky somehow, like it had some strange magnetic pull that kept drawing me closer. I carried it to the checkout, trying to distract myself by browsing other items. But the feeling followed me, a prickling pressure in my chest that I couldn't ignore. Every step I took seemed slightly heavier, every breath slightly more labored. I could feel the figurine pulsing faintly in my hand, though logically I knew that made no sense. I told myself it was just anxiety, just a trick of my mind. But a seed of doubt had been planted, one that grew with every glance at the tiny dollar tag. Even now, I can't explain why I felt so compelled to buy it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe something deeper, something I didn't want to admit to myself. Whatever it was, it felt alive. And I think, somewhere deep down, I knew that the moment I paid for it, nothing would feel ordinary again. Something about that dollar item had already begun its work. I barely made it home before the strange feeling escalated into something I couldn't ignore. At first it was subtle, tiny flashes of unease whenever I glanced at the figurine. I set it on the kitchen counter, thinking that distancing myself from it might lessen the effect. But the moment I looked away and then back, I noticed something I hadn't before. It had shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. Its posture leaning forward, one arm angled differently. My heart thumped hard and I froze, staring at it as if my eyes alone could convince myself I was imagining it. The unease quickly grew into full-blown panic. Every time I passed the figurine, I could swear it had moved ever so slightly, just enough to catch the corner of my eye. The air in the apartment felt heavier, denser, pressing down on me like some invisible weight. Shadows seemed longer, stretching toward the object as if drawn to it. I tried to rationalize. Maybe the table had been bumped, maybe my eyes were playing tricks. But every logical explanation felt hollow. Deep down, I knew something about that item wasn't normal. Then the accident started. Small at first. Spilled water, tripping over a rug, misplacing my keys. Each incident seemed minor, but they were almost too precise, almost like the figurine was orchestrating them. I would pick it up to examine it, and a shiver ran through me, cold and insistent, like a warning I couldn't articulate. The more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the incidents became. My heart raced constantly, my palms were perpetually sweaty, and every creak or sound in my apartment made me jump as if something unseen was moving around me. One night, I woke to a soft thud. My eyes darted to the figurine, and it had moved again, this time closer to the edge of the counter, teetering dangerously as if it might fall. I reached for it, trembling, and felt a strange pulse of energy, almost like static, radiating from it into my hand. I dropped it immediately, stumbling back as the shadows in the room seemed to twist, reaching toward me. I realized with a cold, sinking feeling that this was no ordinary dollar item. Somehow it carried a presence, a force that I couldn't understand or control. I spent hours that night trying to rationalize what had happened, but no explanation fit. The figurine wasn't just an object, it was a catalyst, a trigger, a silent manipulator that had invaded my life and refused to leave. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt its influence seeping into every corner of my apartment, every sound I heard, every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision. By the morning, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever that figurine was, it had found me, and it wasn't going anywhere. After that night, I could barely function. Every glance at the figurine set my nerves on edge, and every small noise in the apartment felt magnified, as if the air itself were conspiring against me. I tried moving it, hiding it in a closet, even wrapping it in a plastic bag, hoping to sever whatever connection I felt. But no matter what I did, its presence lingered. Even across the room, it seemed to draw my attention, pulling at my awareness like a gravitational force I couldn't resist. Sleep became impossible. I would lie in bed, heart pounding, every shadow on the wall morphing into shapes that weren't there. The sound of the ceiling fan became a low hum, vibrating through the apartment, and sometimes I thought I heard the faintest whispers coming from the figurine itself. Rationality screamed that it was my imagination, that I was creating patterns where none existed, but fear is a stubborn, invasive thing, and I couldn't convince myself that what I felt wasn't real. During the day, I avoided being alone. I invited friends over under flimsy pretexts, needing the reassurance of human presence. But even then, the unease didn't vanish. I caught myself staring at the figurine while talking, heart hammering, convinced it had moved again while my back was turned. Each time I reached toward it, I felt that inexplicable cold pulse, and a wave of dread washed over me. I realized that no explanation, no logic, no rationalization could undo the fear that had taken root inside me. I even considered throwing it away, tossing it into the trash and leaving it on the curb, hoping that would end it. But every time I approached the door, an invisible hesitation gripped me. Something about it demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement. I didn't want to let it go, not entirely, because I was terrified of what might happen if I did. And so it stayed, a silent sentinel on my counter, controlling my anxiety, feeding it, magnifying it in ways I couldn't articulate. Weeks passed, and though the accident slowed, the tension didn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, every shadow in the corner of my vision carried the weight of that figurine. It had become a permanent reminder that some objects, some things we dismiss as trivial or cheap, carry forces we cannot comprehend. And I knew, deep down, that the moment I ignored it completely, that's when it would strike, in ways I couldn't predict or prepare for. Even now, I think about that $1 figurine, and I can feel my chest tighten, a cold knot of fear that doesn't fade. It wasn't just a cheap toy, it was a warning, a presence, a harbinger of unease. And for reasons I still don't understand, it found me, and it hasn't let go. I never liked shopping at night, but that day I had no choice. My work schedule had been impossible, and the only time I could make it to Dollar Tree was after everyone else had left, when the store was quiet and almost eerily still. I told myself it would be peaceful. No crowds, no noise, no chaos, just a few minutes to pick up what I needed and leave. But the moment I stepped inside, I realized peaceful wasn't the word I should have used. The store smelled the same, faintly of plastic and cleaning supplies, but there was something else beneath it, a metallic tang, almost imperceptible, clinging to the air like a warning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead it, flickering just enough to make the shadows in the corners twitch. I carried a basket, walking slowly, telling myself to relax, to focus on the mundane task of gathering groceries and household items. But there was an odd stillness, the kind that makes the skin on your neck prickle, the kind that makes every small sound feel amplified. As I moved through the aisles, I noticed I wasn't alone. There was a figure at the far end, just visible behind a shelf. At first I thought it was another customer, lost or distracted, but there was something about the way they moved, or didn't move, that felt unnatural. They were tall, unnervingly straight-backed, and the slow, deliberate sway of their body made my chest tighten. Their clothing matched the store's uniform, but it hung in a way that looked wrong, too stiff, almost mechanical. I froze, staring at them while convincing myself that they were just an employee, maybe restocking shelves. The strange part was that no one else was around. I could hear the soft scuff of my own shoes on the linoleum and the occasional hum of a distant freezer, but nothing else. No cashiers, no other customers, not even the faint sound of carts rolling. Yet this figure lingered, always at the edge of my vision, always appearing exactly where I didn't expect them. My pulse quickened, and I tried to focus on picking up a few things quickly, but every time I turned a corner, I felt that same weight of eyes on me, following, observing, silently. Something about that late-night emptiness amplified the sense of isolation. The store, familiar and mundane in daylight, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The aisles seemed longer, darker, and the fluorescent light flickered more insistently, drawing attention to corners that had no reason to exist. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was overthinking, imagining the figure moving when they were just walking the store. But the pit in my stomach told me I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was here, and I wasn't sure they wanted me to leave. I tried to focus on my shopping, telling myself that the figure at the far end of the aisle was just another employee. But the moment I turned to reach for a pack of paper towels, I felt it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a presence brushing against the edge of my awareness. I froze, basket in hand, heart hammering. When I glanced up, the figure was closer, though I hadn't seen them move. My pulse spiked, a cold knot of panic forming in my stomach. I debated leaving immediately, but every instinct that screamed "run" was met with a paralyzing hesitation. Something about the way they stood, motionless, silent, and impossibly still, held me in place. The store, normally so mundane, felt alien. Shadows pooled unnaturally around the corners, and the fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythm that seemed to match my racing heartbeat. Even the faint hum of the freezers felt louder, almost a low, vibrating warning that made my teeth clench. Then came the whisper, low, deliberate, barely audible, but unmistakably there. "Do you see me?" My eyes darted around the aisle. No one else, nothing else, just the figure, standing silently at the far end as if taunting me. I took a tentative step backward, and the sound of my own foot hitting the linoleum echoed, exaggerated, unnaturally loud. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, heavy and tangible. My chest tightened. It felt like the space between us had condensed, compressing the aisle, the shelves, even the light itself, pressing in from all sides. I tried to keep moving, grabbing items from the shelves, pretending to focus on normal tasks. But every time I looked up, the figure had shifted closer, impossibly silent, always at the periphery of my vision. I could feel their attention like a physical weight, pressing against my back, crawling along my shoulders, suffocating in its intensity. My breath became shallow, rapid, each inhale sharp and uneven. I stumbled over a stray box of canned goods and cursed under my breath, but even that small noise didn't seem to startle them. They simply remained unwavering, as though feeding on my panic. I finally reached the end of the aisle, thinking I could escape by turning the corner toward the checkout. But the path I expected wasn't there. Instead, a mirrored section of the aisle stretched before me, shelves stacked identically, fluorescent lights flickering just enough to disorient me further. Panic surged. My legs refused to move with purpose. My mind was trapped in the awareness of that silent figure, impossibly still, impossibly close. The store had shifted, I had shifted, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. When I finally stumbled out of the store, the cool night air hit me like a wave, and I gasped for it, desperate for a sense of normalcy. My legs were weak, my hands trembling, and my chest burned from the sheer panic that had built inside me. For a few moments I stood in the parking lot, shivering, convincing myself that stepping outside was the final act of escape. But deep down I knew the experience hadn't ended. That figure, whatever it was, had imprinted itself on my mind. For the next several days, I couldn't stop replaying the incident. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that aisle. The fluorescent lights flickering, the shadows twisting unnaturally, and that impossible figure standing silently at the end. Even in daylight, I would startle at the shadow of a coat rack or the silhouette of a passerby, imagining them moving like the midnight shopper. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, gnawing paranoia, an awareness that I was being watched even when no one was there. I tried to rationalize it, of course. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet of a late-night store, or exhaustion from long work hours. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, or a trick of my mind, but each explanation felt hollow. Every time I imagined returning to the store, I felt that same cold, insistent dread, a visceral knot in my chest that I couldn't shake. The thought of seeing the figure again, motionless, impossibly still, observing, was enough to make my hands clammy and my stomach churn. Even routine things became difficult. I avoided the aisles where the clearance sections were located. I skipped late-night shopping trips entirely, opting for daylight whenever possible, though it didn't erase the memory. Shadows in my apartment seemed longer. Every creak of the floor sounded amplified, and sometimes I would swear I could feel eyes on me, even in the emptiest room. The sense of being watched had followed me home, a reminder that some experiences are not confined to the place where they occur. They linger, settle into your mind, and refuse to let go. I realized, with a sinking understanding, that some encounters leave more than memories. They leave a part of themselves behind. The midnight shopper, that impossible, silent presence, had marked me. It didn't matter that I had left the store. Its influence had seeped into my awareness, a quiet terror that came unbidden, a constant shadow at the edge of perception. And I knew that no matter what I did, I could never return to the sense of safety I once took for granted. Some things I realized aren't meant to be seen, but once they are, they never leave. I always thought checkout lines were harmless, the final mundane step of any shopping trip. That's what I told myself the first time I noticed it. A subtle, unnerving presence at the end of the register, something I couldn't place but couldn't ignore. It's Sayed. Started on a weekend, during one of my late afternoon Dollar Tree visits. The store was moderately busy, the usual hum of carts and chatter filling the air, but there was something about the last few registers that felt wrong. I had a small basket that day, just a few items, cleaning supplies, some cheap snacks, a small candle. I chose a lane at random, one far from the main traffic, thinking it would be quicker. The line was empty except for me, and the cashier was a young woman with a polite smile, scanning items without issue. Everything seemed normal, until I reached for my wallet. That's when I noticed it, the reflection in the polished metal divider at the end of the counter. At first I thought it was another customer behind me, waiting silently. But when I turned, no one was there. The reflection lingered, a vague shape that didn't belong to anyone in the store. My pulse quickened, and I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the lighting, the fluorescent hum bouncing off the metal. But the more I looked, the less it made sense. I stepped forward, setting my items on the conveyor, and the reflection seemed to move with me, staying at the very edge of my vision. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. There was something off about its proportions, the way it leaned slightly forward, unnaturally, like it had weight that pressed down on the counter. My hands were clammy, my stomach twisting as I forced a smile at the cashier, pretending nothing was wrong. But the reflection persisted, and a shiver ran down my spine that I couldn't shake. Even now I don't fully understand why I didn't leave immediately. Maybe curiosity, maybe denial, maybe the stubborn hope that it was just a trick. Whatever it was, it had caught my attention, and my attention is exactly what it wanted. I placed my items on the counter, fumbled with my coins, and tried to focus on the mundane act of payment, but the sense of being watched, of something lingering just beyond comprehension, refused to let me concentrate. It was patient, silent, and infinitely aware, as if the checkout lane had become a threshold between normalcy and something far more sinister. As I stood there, fumbling with my wallet, the reflection didn't just linger, it shifted. Not dramatically, not like a normal person moving, but in subtle, impossible ways. It leaned slightly closer, tilting its head in a way no one could naturally do. My pulse thundered in my ears. I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was a trick of the metal, a distorted angle. But the instant I glanced back, the figure was there again, closer than before, unnervingly still, watching. The cashier scanned my items with mechanical precision, unaware of what I was seeing. Every beep of the scanner felt deafening, echoing in the suddenly heavy silence of my own mind. The reflection wasn't bound by logic. As I shifted my weight, it mirrored me, but not exactly. A fraction slower, a fraction too deliberate. It wasn't me, yet it was, and that subtle difference set my nerves on fire. I wanted to step back, to leave my basket and run, but my legs refused. Some invisible gravity held me there, eyes locked on that impossible figure. Then it moved in a way that made my stomach drop. It raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, pointing at me. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one behind me, yet the gesture was unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. A trick of the eerie. Afflection, a shadow, a misplaced mannequin, but none fit. Nothing could account for the cold, oppressive weight of awareness pressing against my back, as though I had become prey in a space that should have been entirely ordinary. I tried to pay quickly, fumbling with bills and coins, my hands shaking violently. The reflection leaned ever so slightly closer with each movement, silent except for the soft, rhythmic hum of the lights overhead. I could feel sweat running down my spine, and every instinct screamed to run, to abandon my items and leave the store immediately. But as I grabbed my bag, I noticed the reflection's eyes, or what I thought were eyes, following me with intent. I froze again, panic clawing at my chest, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with reality. Finally, with trembling hands, I turned to leave. The moment my back faced the counter, the reflection vanished, just like that, as if it had never existed. I stumbled toward the exit, my heart hammering, my mind reeling with disbelief. Outside, the normal sounds of the world, traffic, distant voices, the rustle of leaves, felt impossibly loud, grounding me, reminding me that the terror had been confined to that narrow, fluorescent-lit space. But even now, I know it wasn't gone. The memory lingers, a silent weight pressing at the edge of my perception. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it, and that's what terrifies me most. Something as mundane as a checkout lane, in a store I've walked past hundreds of times, became a place where reality warped, where a reflection wasn't just a reflection, and it knew I was watching. After that night, every trip to a store, even during the day, felt different. Checkout lanes, once banal and forgettable, now carried a weight I couldn't shake. I found myself scanning every reflective surface, every polished divider, half expecting to see that impossible figure again. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and the fluorescent lights felt harsher, as if drawing attention to corners where something unseen could be hiding. The memory of that reflection had burrowed deep into my mind, a persistent echo of fear I couldn't escape. Sleep became a minefield. I would close my eyes and see the figure, impossibly still, pointing silently from the metal divider. My dreams were punctuated by flickering lights, endless aisles, and reflections that weren't my own. Even waking moments weren't safe. Every reflective surface in my apartment, a mirror, a window, the screen of my phone, could suddenly host that silent presence. My hands would shake involuntarily, my chest tight, as if my body had stored the panic of that night and refused to release it. Friends noticed the change. Casual trips with them became anxiety-laden affairs. I would avoid lines, move hastily through aisles, and flinch at shadows. I tried to explain, to tell someone what I saw, but words felt inadequate. It was just a reflection, they said. You're overthinking. But they didn't understand that it wasn't just what I saw. It was how it made me feel. The awareness, the deliberate intent, the unshakable feeling of being watched followed me everywhere. Even in my own home, I sometimes froze mid-step, convinced the figure had slipped through some invisible barrier, observing from the periphery. I avoided that Dollar Tree for weeks. Eventually, I returned during daylight, rationalizing that the store couldn't possibly harbor whatever had terrified me the night before. And yet, even then, I felt a twinge of dread whenever I passed a reflective surface. Every aisle suddenly suspect, every quiet moment amplified. The checkout lane, so ordinary and mundane, had transformed in my mind into a place of quiet horror, a threshold where something beyond comprehension had existed just out of reach. Even now, months later, I can't fully explain what happened. The reflection might have been a trick of the mind, fatigue, or the isolation of a late-night store. But the way my heart races when I think about it, the way shadows seem heavier and reflective surfaces feel alive, tells me something beyond reason occurred. That night changed the way I perceive ordinary spaces, reminding me that even the most mundane places can hide something unsettling, something patient, something that watches, and that presence, silent and deliberate, will never truly leave. I had been shopping at Dollar Tree for years, but that night felt different from the moment I walked through the automatic doors. The store was quiet, eerily so, with only a faint hum from the fluorescent lights overhead. The air smelled of cheap plastic, paper, and cleaning chemicals, but underneath it lingered something else, a metallic tang, subtle and unsettling. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just tired, that the long day at work had left me on edge. Yet even as I wandered toward the aisles, I felt an almost imperceptible pressure at the back of my mind, as if the space around me were observing every step I took. I was alone, or so I thought. The aisles stretched out in front of me, narrow paths lined with dollar items of all shapes and sizes. As I moved, I noticed a shadow that didn't seem to belong, stretching across the floor along the base of the shelves. At first, I assumed it was my own, distorted by the flickering lights above, but as I continued, I realized the shadow didn't move in sync with me. It lingered behind me, detached, almost sentient. My heart rate quickened, and I tried to dismiss it as a trick of perspective, a play of light and darkness. The deeper into the store I went, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The usual background noise, carts clattering, soft chatter, distant beeping of scanners, was replaced by a stifling silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floor. I could feel the hair on my arm stand on end, and an uneasy awareness prickled at the back of my neck. The aisles themselves seemed to shift subtly, stretching slightly longer than they should, bending in ways my mind couldn't immediately process. I could see the end of the aisle, but it felt impossibly far, as if the shelves were drawing me deeper, guiding me towards some unknown point. Something about the shadows unnerved me more than anything else. They seemed to pulse, elongate, and shift almost imperceptibly when I wasn't looking directly at them. The mundane items on the shelves, cheap toys, cleaning supplies, snack packs, suddenly looked foreign, almost alive. My rational mind told me I was imagining it, that my tired brain was playing tricks, but the cold knot of dread in my stomach refused to lie. There was something in that aisle, something beyond the ordinary, waiting. And for the first time, I understood that the store, familiar and benign in daylight, could transform into a place of subtle, almost invisible terror when the lights dimmed, the aisles emptied, and the shadows moved just slightly differently than expected. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself, but it didn't help. The longer I lingered, the more I felt it. The presence, quiet and patient, embedded in the aisle itself. Something was watching, waiting, aware of me in a way that chilled me to my core. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a shopping trip. This was the start of something I couldn't yet understand, something that would linger far longer than the hour I had planned to spend in the store. As I continued down the aisle, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in ways that defied logic. At first, it was subtle, a corner of a shelf that appeared darker than it should, a small flicker in the overhead lights, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Objects on the shelves seemed to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. A bag of chips tilting, a stack of cans leaning as if reacting to my presence. My stomach twisted into knots, and I felt a prickle of sweat run down my spine, but I forced myself to keep walking. I needed to understand what was happening, to see it for myself and prove that my mind wasn't breaking. The further I went, the heavier the air became, as if the aisle itself was pressing down on me. The hum of the fluorescent lights warped subtly, fluctuating in tone in a way that made my teeth ache. I could hear faint whispers, almost imperceptible, curling through the air like smoke. I strained to catch the words, but they dissolved before they reached clarity. It was a voice, or multiple voices, but not one I could identify. Each step I took felt deliberate, measured, as if the aisle itself was guiding me towards something I wasn't meant to find. And then I saw it, a figure at the far end standing perfectly still. My heart jumped violently into my throat. It wasn't human, or at least it didn't seem entirely human. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, tall and unnervingly straight, but its features were indistinct, as though blurred by some distortion in the air itself. I froze, basket still in hand, unable to move, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure didn't approach, didn't move in any conventional sense, yet the oppressive feeling of its awareness pressed against me like a tangible weight. Every instinct screamed to turn and run, but I couldn't. The aisle had transformed into a trap. The shadows around me pulsed, reaching along the shelves toward me, stretching unnaturally as if alive. My eyes darted to the exits, but they seemed impossibly far, obscured by darkness and the elongating shadows. I tried to focus on a rational thought. Maybe it was an employee in costume, a trick of the lights, but my mind couldn't form a coherent explanation. The fear had seeped into every nerve ending, a cold, suffocating panic that left me trembling uncontrollably. Finally, a loud crash echoed from behind me, a stack of cans falling over, and I jumped, sending my basket clattering to the floor. The figure flinched as if reacting to the sound, though it didn't move closer. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale shaky and uneven. I didn't wait to process what was happening any longer. I bolted, weaving through the aisle, the shadows seeming to twist around me, and burst out into the brighter, safer sections of the store. But even as I reached the checkout and left the store that night, the feeling of being watched, the imprint of the aisle and its shadows, followed me relentlessly. After that night, even the thought of Dollar Tree made my stomach twist. I couldn't walk past an aisle without imagining shadows stretching on us. Turley or seeing that vague, humanoid figure standing silently at the far end. Every reflective surface, every dark corner felt like a portal to that same oppressive presence. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of fatigue, the store's flickering lights, or my imagination running wild, but the unease persisted, gnawing at me with an intensity I couldn't ignore. Sleep offered little relief. My dreams were filled with aisles that stretched endlessly, shelves bending and shifting, and shadows that followed me with silent intent. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that something had moved in my apartment while I slept. Even mundane noises, the creak of floorboards, the hum of a fridge, the soft flicker of lights, made me tense, my body reacting before my mind could rationalize. The aisle, the figure, the shadows, they had left an imprint that refused to fade. I became hyper-aware in public spaces. Walking through stores during the day, I found myself constantly scanning, checking corners, and flinching at the slightest movement. Shadows, no matter how ordinary, felt alive. Reflective surfaces seemed to hold something just out of sight, something patient, waiting. Friends noticed my jumpiness, my hesitation to linger in aisles, and asked if I was okay. I couldn't explain it. How do you describe a shadow that moves when you aren't looking, or a presence that watches without being seen? My words felt inadequate, and so I stayed silent, leaving only my tension as evidence of what had occurred. The store itself became a psychological landmark. Even when I avoided it, the memory lingered, embedded in my mind like a scar. The aisles, the flickering lights, the way the shadows twisted. The memory would surface in random moments, pulling me back into that narrow, fluorescent-lit space. I realized that some experiences aren't confined to time or place. They follow you, embedding themselves in your perception, altering how you interpret ordinary spaces. And the worst part? The feeling of being watched never fully left. Even in my own home, I sometimes pause mid-step, convinced a shadow shifted differently than it should, or that a corner of my room holds some silent observer. The store had changed me, leaving a permanent mark. Isle of Shadows wasn't just a memory. It became a lens through which I viewed the world, a reminder that even the most mundane spaces could hide something patient, deliberate, and inexplicably alive. I had always considered the clearance section at Dollar Tree a treasure hunt, a place where cheap finds could surprise you. That day, it seemed ordinary enough. Rows of discounted items stacked haphazardly, the usual mix of expired candles, odd knickknacks, and half-empty packages. But there was a tension in the air I couldn't shake, subtle and nagging, like static that prickled the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the long hours of work had left me exhausted and jittery. Yet the moment I stepped into the clearance aisle, the ordinary world felt warped. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting uneven pools of light that distorted the shapes of the items on the shelves. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners, stretching across the floor, and I felt a strange, almost imperceptible pressure pressing down on me. It was like walking into a room that remembered everyone who had been there before. In every misstep, every glance, and quietly recorded it. I shrugged off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing more than the store's lighting and my tired mind, but the knot of unease in my stomach refused to release. I began scanning the shelves, moving slowly through the tightly packed aisle, searching for something useful. That's when I noticed the first oddity, an item that seemed out of place. A small ceramic figurine, dirt-smudged and chipped, sat tucked between a stack of discounted notebooks and a faded pack of kitchen sponges. It looked insignificant, almost forgotten, but something about it drew my gaze, held me there. I reached for it, feeling a strange chill that ran up my arm the moment my fingers brushed the surface. It wasn't just cold, it was alive in a way I couldn't explain. Not literally, of course, but the sensation was undeniable. A pulse of unease that seemed to respond to my touch. I pulled back, my heart hammering, telling myself it was absurd. It was just a cheap trinket, a discarded item destined for the trash. But the chill lingered, creeping into my bones, leaving a residue of fear that I couldn't dismiss. As I continued down the aisle, I realized the air itself had changed. It felt thicker, heavier, as if the space had absorbed something patient, silent, and observant. I wasn't alone, though I couldn't see anyone. Every small noise, cans shifting, plastic crinkling, a distant cough, felt amplified, echoing in the confined aisle. And every glance at the figurine reminded me that some things, even in a mundane clearance section, carry a weight beyond explanation. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but I knew instinctively that this shopping trip wouldn't end like the others. Something in that aisle, something embedded in that cheap, forgotten object had found me, and for reasons I couldn't yet comprehend, it was woke. Aiding. I couldn't shake the figurine from my mind. Even as I continued down the clearance aisle, my eyes kept drifting back to it, drawn by a strange insistence I couldn't explain. Every time I glanced away, a shadow seemed to shift around it, subtle but undeniable. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that my imagination was running wild. But the longer I lingered, the more I felt an oppressive weight pressing down on me, like the aisle itself was leaning closer, watching my every movement. Then it moved. Not dramatically, just a slight tilt, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my chest tighten and my stomach churn. I froze, staring, heart hammering, willing my mind to find a rational explanation. Maybe it had fallen from the shelf on its own. Maybe I had imagined the motion. But as I took another step, I realized the figurine had shifted again, closer to the edge of the shelf, as though nudged by a presence invisible to me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Every instinct screamed to leave, to abandon my basket and run. But curiosity, a stubborn and foolish need to understand, held me in place. I bent slightly to pick up the figurine, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper, like the rustle of paper. almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. "Take me. Don't leave me." My hands trembled violently, and I dropped the item back onto the shelf, stepping back. The whisper stopped immediately, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the aisle feel impossibly long, impossibly narrow. Then came the subtle movement along the edges of the aisle. Shadows flickered, stretching unnaturally, twisting around the shelves. Items I hadn't touched shifted slightly. Cans leaned, plastic wrappings crinkled, and the air seemed to thrum with a tension that made my skin crawl. I could feel it then, a presence coiling around me, patient, deliberate, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, breath ragged, and my hands shook so violently that I could barely pick up my basket. I bolted. Not slowly, not carefully, just ran, weaving through the aisles as the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, reaching, following. The figurine remained on the shelf, innocuous and small, but I could feel its weight in the air behind me, like a lingering pressure pressing against my back. I didn't stop until I reached the checkout, hands shaking as I paid and fled the store entirely. Even out in the parking lot, in the cool night air, the feeling lingered. A subtle, nagging dread, the unmistakable sense that something had found me, marked me, and was quietly waiting for the next opportunity. After that night, the clearance aisle haunted me more than any other part of the store. Even the thought of cheap, discounted items made my stomach twist, a reminder of the oppressive presence I had felt pressing in from every shadow. It wasn't just the figurine, it was the space itself, the way the aisle seemed alive, aware, waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it, the tiny ceramic figure perched on the shelf, the shadows around it stretching and shifting as if breathing. Sleep became difficult. My dreams were filled with endless rows of discounted items, shadows that twisted and reached for me, and the whisper of that faint, impossible voice. I would wake with my heart hammering, convinced that the presence had followed me into my bedroom, settling into the corners, behind doors, in reflective surfaces. Even in my waking hours, I would jump at the sound of a crinkle, or the faint tap of something moving. The ordinary objects in my home, books, trinkets, even my phone, felt momentarily alive, as if they were extensions of that cursed aisle, quietly observing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was exhaustion, my mind weaving fear into mundane experiences. Maybe the flickering lights, the isolation of the late-night store, and the subtle unease of the clearance section had combined to create a hallucination. But the intensity of the experience, the lingering physical sensation of pressure and dread, told me it had been real. There had been something deliberate in the way the shadows moved, something that waited patiently for me to reach out, something that responded to my attention like a predator to prey. The store itself became a symbol of my unease. Even passing by during the day, I felt the pull of that aisle, the lingering sensation of being watched. I avoided the clearance section entirely, shuffling my cart past it without looking, but the memory remained. It wasn't just a store anymore. It was a threshold where something beyond understanding had existed. That tiny, chipped figurine became an emblem of the inexplicable, a reminder that even mundane, discounted objects could carry a weight that words couldn't describe. Over time, I realized that some experiences don't end when you leave the location. They follow you, etched into perception, altering how you move through the world. The cursed clearance aisle didn't just scare me. It changed the way I interpreted shadows, silence, and the spaces between objects. It left me wary, hyper-aware, and forever conscious that some corners of ordinary life are not as harmless as they appear. Even now, months later, the memory remains sharp, a quiet, persistent dread that refuses to fade, reminding me that some bargains come with a terrifying price, one you carry long after leaving the store. I thought I had seen every corner of the Dollar Tree, every aisle memorized from countless visits over the years. But that night I discovered there was one I had never noticed, or maybe one that didn't exist before. It appeared when the store was nearly empty, the late-night hum of the fluorescent lights creating long shadows along the shelves. The aisle seemed ordinary at first glance, shelves stacked with household items, snacks, and trinkets. But the moment I stepped closer, the world shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, and I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. The air in the aisle felt heavier, almost viscous, pressing against my skin and filling my lungs with a sense of suffocating stillness. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting elongated shadows that didn't match any physical object. I told myself it was fatigue or the hum of the store, but the pressure persisted, like the space itself was aware of my presence. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the linoleum, echoing back at me with a hollow resonance that set my nerves on edge. At first, I tried to convince myself I had simply overlooked the aisle in previous visits. But the longer I stared down it, the stranger it became. The shelves appeared to stretch, elongating slightly as though the aisle was breathing. Objects on the shelves seemed subtly misaligned, tilting and shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. A pack of paper towels leaned against a stack of plates at an impossible angle, and I felt a flicker of panic that made me step back. Something about this aisle wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. I hesitated, a mix of curiosity and dread keeping me frozen at the threshold. Every instinct told me to turn and leave, yet another part of me was drawn forward, compelled to see what lay at the far end. It wasn't just an aisle, it was a presence, a weight in the air that seemed to pulse with quiet awareness. I could feel it observing me, patient, deliberate, silent, as if it had existed long before I ever stepped into the store. And then there was the silence. Unlike any other aisle, there were no subtle hums, no distant beeps, no footsteps echoing from other shoppers. Even the faint whisper of air from the vents was absent. It was as though the aisle had carved out its own space, isolated from the ordinary store around it. Every sound I made seemed amplified, every movement exaggerated, and every glance down the corridor made my heart pound faster. I realized with a sinking certainty that this aisle was not just another section of the store. It was a place that had appeared for a reason, and that reason, I feared, had something to do with me. As I stepped into the aisle, the air seemed to thicken further, pressing against me like a living thing. The shelves stretched unnaturally, and every object seemed subtly alive, slightly tilted, faintly vibrating, as though anticipating my every move. My chest tightened, my palms grew clammy, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward, a morbid curiosity I couldn't resist. I moved slowly, each step echoing unnaturally, and the further I went, the stranger everything became. I noticed shadows at the periphery of my vision, writhing and elongating independently of the objects casting them. I tried to focus on one shelf or one item, but the shadows shifted whenever I tried to look directly. A pack of sponges trembled on its stack, and I swear it shifted closer, as if pulled by some invisible hand. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, echoing the impossible rhythm of the aisle itself. I took a hesitant step forward, and then froze. Something moved at the far end, a figure, vague and indistinct, not entirely human, standing perfectly still. The figure didn't approach, yet its presence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I could feel its awareness, patient and deliberate, stretching along the length of the aisle. My stomach twisted, and an icy sweat ran down my spine. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The fluorescent lights above flickered, and for a brief moment the aisle seemed to expand, elongating like a corridor in a nightmare. Every familiar object now appeared distorted, almost mocking me with their normality. Then I heard it, a low, rasping whisper, impossible to locate, coming from all directions at once. "You shouldn't be here," it murmured, dissolving into silence just as quickly as it appeared. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a display of cheap candles. The figure remained unmoving, yet I could feel it following me. Each step I took mirrored in a subtle, impossible way by the shifting shadows. Panic finally took hold. I bolted, weaving through the aisle, trying to escape the suffocating weight of its gaze. The shadows twisted, curling toward me, almost tangible, stretching across the floor and brushing my feet. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. When I finally burst into the brighter, more familiar section of the store, the oppressive feeling lifted slightly, but I knew it hadn't gone. The phantom aisle had left its mark, an invisible tether attaching me to its impossible space. Even in the safety of the main aisles, the sense of being watched clung to me. Insidious and unyielding, a silent promise that this encounter was far from over. After that night, the memory of the phantom aisle haunted me more persistently than any other part of the store. Even the thought of Dollar Tree now carried a subtle, creeping anxiety. I found myself hyper-aware of aisles, reflective surfaces, and shadows, scanning corners that had never seemed threatening before. It wasn't just a store anymore. It had transformed into a space layered with hidden, almost imperceptible threats, each one waiting patiently for my attention. Sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams were filled with endless aisles, shadows that stretched impossibly long, and that indistinct figure standing silently at the far end, always watching. I would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced that the presence had followed me home, lingering in the corners of my room or hidden in the flicker of my electronics. Ordinary sounds, the hum of a fridge, the creak of a floorboard, even the distant rustle of leaves, felt amplified, menacing, as if echoing the silent threat of the aisle. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the aisle hadn't truly appeared. Maybe it was a trick of light, exhaustion, or imagination running wild. Yet no explanation satisfied the deep physical unease I felt, the moment of tension, the suffocating awareness, and the figure's impossibly patient watchfulness had etched themselves into my perception. Even mundane shadows in my apartment seemed alive, subtly shifting in ways that set my nerves on edge. The aisle had taught me a terrifying lesson. Ordinary spaces could harbor the extraordinary, and it would not reveal itself fully, leaving only doubt and dread. Returning to the store during daylight didn't help. The phantom aisle seemed to vanish in the bright, busy environment, but the feeling it left lingered, heavy and persistent. Every aisle, every shelf seemed a potential threshold, a place where something patient and deliberate could emerge if I weren't careful. I avoided late-night trips entirely, yet even then the memory followed me. A quiet, insidious presence that refused to fade. I realized that some experiences don't remain confined to time or space. They follow you, altering perception, reshaping the ordinary into a potential trap. The phantom aisle had left its mark on me permanently, instilling a hyper-awareness, a nervous vigilance that no rational explanation could erase. Even months later, the sense of being observed in quiet corners, the echo of that impossible figure, and the weight of unseen eyes in my peripheral vision remain. The aisle had taught me that the ordinary is never truly safe, and some places, like that one hidden corner of the store, exist for reasons beyond comprehension, quietly, patiently waiting for the next unwitting visitor. I had always assumed that late-night shifts at Dollar Tree were monotonous, predictable, just long hours of stocking shelves, cleaning, and dealing with the occasional tired customer. That assumption shattered the night I first noticed him, the midnight manager. I was finishing a shift later than usual, the store mostly empty, with only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building to break the silence. That's when I saw him, or at least the figure who called himself the manager. He appeared behind the checkout counter, casual and silent, yet impossible to ignore. He didn't move like a regular person. There was a stiffness to him, an unnatural smoothness in the way he shifted from one foot to the other, like a puppet guided by invisible strings. His uniform was crisp, clean, and too perfect, almost antiseptic, but his eyes, dark and hollow, carried a weight I couldn't identify. The air around him felt heavier, charged with a subtle, oppressive energy that set my nerves on edge. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of exhaustion after a long day. But the deeper I looked, the more certain I became that something about him was fundamentally wrong. He seemed aware of everything in the store, not just me, but the aisles, the shelves, the flickering lights themselves. It was as if he existed simultaneously in the present moment and somewhere else entirely, observing both. A cold chill ran down my spine as I realized that the store, so familiar and mundane during the day, had transformed into a labyrinth of tension, with him at the center, silent and vigilant. I tried to continue my routine, stocking shelves mechanically, convincing myself that he was just a late-night employee performing his job. But the further I worked, the more his presence pressed on me. Every glance toward the counter revealed him standing there, perfectly still, unnervingly still, yet aware of every small movement I made. Even as I focused on organizing products, a subtle dread seeped into my consciousness. A persistent, nagging sense that he wasn't just watching me, but evaluating me, measuring my reactions, waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. The store around me seemed to respond to him as well. Shadows deepened near his station, lights flickered more aggressively in his vicinity, and the ambient hum of the night felt warped, amplified, as if synchronized with his silent presence. The familiarity of the aisles was gone. They now felt like part of a stage set for a performance I hadn't agreed to participate in. That night, I realized the midnight manager wasn't just another employee. He was the heartbeat of the store after dark, a presence that turned ordinary tasks into exercises in unease. As the night wore on, his presence became impossible to ignore. Every small noise, the clatter of cans, the hum of the fluorescent lights, even my own breathing, felt amplified in the confined space around him. I could sense him watching, waiting, silently observing every movement I made. When I glanced toward the checkout counter, he was always there, perfectly still, unnaturally calm, as if he existed outside the normal flow of time. My stomach twisted with a growing unease, but something held me in place. A mixture of fear, curiosity, and the inexplicable pull of his gaze. It started subtly at first. Items I had just organized seemed slightly displaced when I returned to them, edges misaligned, packaging skewed in ways I hadn't left them. I told myself it was fatigue, that I was imagining the changes. But then came the sounds, soft whispers, barely audible, that seemed to emerge from the checkout counter itself. I strained to listen, but the words dissolved before they fully formed, leaving only the lingering impression that I was being addressed directly. My hands trembled as I tried to focus, yet the store seemed to close in around me, the aisles narrowing, the shelves tilting slightly toward his station. Then I saw it, a movement that defied explanation. A pack of cleaning wipes slowly slid off the shelf in front of me, not falling immediately, but gliding with an unnatural smoothness toward the counter where he stood. My heart leapt and I froze, unable to look away. He didn't reach for it, didn't acknowledge it in any way, yet it ended up perfectly stacked at his side as if guided by invisible hands. The sheer impossibility of it left me paralyzed with fear, realizing that he was not just an observer, he controlled the space around him in ways that made no logical sense. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice caught in my throat. The air grew heavy, pressing down, and I felt the temperature drop, a cold, creeping chill that sank into my bones. Shadows stretched unnaturally from the shelves, curling subtly toward him and then recoiling, almost as if obeying his silent command. Panic surged, and my rational mind screamed to leave, but my legs moved sluggishly, weighed down by some unseen force. Finally, I bolted toward the exit, weaving through the aisles as if fleeing a predator. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, and I swore I saw him in multiple places at once, sometimes at the checkout, sometimes halfway, down an aisle, impossibly still, impossibly watching. When I burst into the parking lot, gasping for breath, the weight of his presence lingered. I knew then that the Midnight Manager wasn't bound by the ordinary rules of reality. He existed in the store as a silent overseer, a presence that could manipulate space, objects, and perception itself. And worse, I understood that this encounter had marked me, tethered me in some small, terrifying way to the store and its unsettling nocturnal rhythm. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block, gasping for air under the dim yellow streetlights. My chest ached, my vision blurred, but the need to get distance between myself and that store consumed me. Even once I slowed, trembling hands pressed against my knees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the manager's eyes were still on me, watching from behind the glass, or worse, from somewhere I couldn't see. The night air should have been a relief, but it felt just as heavy as the inside of the store. When I finally gathered enough courage to turn around, the store looked exactly as it always did. The windows were dark, the neon sign humming faintly above the entrance. No sign of the man, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. If someone else had been with me, I might have laughed it off, said fatigue had played tricks on my mind. But the memory of those gliding objects, the suffocating air, the flickering lights, it was too vivid, too real to dismiss. For days afterward, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it had been stress, hallucinations born from exhaustion and overwork. I told myself the man had been a regular manager, quiet and unnerving, but ultimately human. Yet the explanations rang hollow every time I replayed the memory in my head. The way the wipes had slid across the aisle still haunted me. There had been no slope, no push, no earthly reason. And that look in his eyes, the calm, endless stare, it wasn't something a person carried. It was something other. Sleep became difficult. I'd close my eyes and see him standing by the register perfectly still, his gaze locking onto mine across the darkened aisles. Sometimes I'd jolt awake in the middle of the night, convinced he was in my room, silently watching from the corner. I'd flick on the lamp, and of course nothing would be there. But the dread lingered, a constant weight pressing at the edges of my mind. I avoided the store after that, even during the day, but every time I passed by I felt a pull, a subtle but undeniable urge to look inside, as though something within wanted me back. I never saw him during daylight hours, but that didn't ease my fear. If anything, it made it worse, because it meant he existed only in that liminal, unsettling space when the world outside was asleep, when shadows grew long and silence pressed in. To this day, I don't know what he was. A ghost, a manifestation, something that slipped between our world and another. All I know is that the Dollar Tree at night will never feel like just a store again. For me, it will always be a place where reality bent, where a silent figure watched with impossible authority. And sometimes when I catch myself glancing through darkened windows, I swear I see a flicker of movement, a manager who doesn't belong, waiting patiently for me to step back inside. I always thought of Dollar Tree as the most ordinary place in the world, the kind of store you went to without thinking, just to grab dish soap, a cheap snack, or some last-minute holiday decorations. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't special, and maybe that's why it was comforting. There was a sort of safety in its predictability. The same aisles, the same fluorescent hum, the same bland smell of cardboard and cleaning chemicals. But the night that sticks with me, the one that still feels heavier than the rest, happened during a shift I almost didn't take. I had. He'd been covering hours for a coworker, and though I didn't want to stay late, the overtime pay was too tempting. It was a cold evening, the kind that makes your breath fog and your skin itch under your coat. The store had already emptied out, most of the day's noise and chatter gone, leaving behind silence that grew louder by the minute. There's something unnatural about being in a Dollar Tree after hours. With no customers around, it doesn't feel like a place meant for people. The shelves, stripped down from the day, looked skeletal, like ribs jutting out of the walls. The floor, usually scuffed by dozens of shoes, felt too still, too polished in its emptiness. I couldn't shake the thought that the building itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. I tried to distract myself by working faster, stocking shelves, breaking down boxes, anything to fill the silence. But every so often, I caught myself listening. For what, I wasn't sure. Maybe footsteps, maybe the sound of a cart squeaking over tile. Sometimes I thought I heard the faintest rustle, like bags brushing together in the candy aisle, though no one was there. The break room clock ticked slower than it should have, dragging minutes into what felt like hours. My body was tired, but my mind was sharp, jittery, alive with the kind of anxious awareness that comes when you know you're being watched. At one point, I even walked through every aisle, convincing myself the store was empty. It was, or at least it looked that way. Still, as I stood by the register later that night, waiting for closing tasks to finish, I felt it, the weight of eyes that weren't there, the pressure of something hidden just beyond sight. And though I told myself I was imagining it, deep down I knew this shift would not end like the others. It started with the register. I had just finished wiping down the counter when the drawer sprang open on its own, slamming forward with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty store. I froze, cloth still in my hand, staring at the open till like it had just shouted my name. I hadn't pressed a button, hadn't touched a key. My first thought was maybe I'd leaned against something, but no, the keypad sat untouched. I slowly closed the drawer, forcing a laugh under my breath, trying to brush it off as a glitch. But the moment my hand let go, the register beeped and spit out a receipt. The paper rolled out in jagged fits, printing nothing but blank white lines before tearing itself free and dropping onto the counter. That was when the air shifted. I can't explain it any other way. It felt like the temperature dropped 5 degrees in seconds. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, almost like static pressing against my ears. And then came the sound that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. The shuffle of footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from aisle 3. My heart stuttered. I had just walked that aisle not 10 minutes earlier, checked every corner, every shelf. Nobody had been there. Yet now I could hear it. Shoes dragging across tile, pausing, then moving again. I called out, "Hello? We're closed!" My voice cracked halfway through, and the words didn't sound convincing even to me. No reply, just the steady shuffle, moving closer. I stepped out from behind the counter, clutching the rag in my hand like it was some kind of weapon. The sound stopped. Silence swallowed the store again, but I knew something was still there. I edged toward aisle 3, each step heavier than the last. The shelves loomed taller, the gaps between them darker, more cavernous than they had any right to be. And then, halfway down the aisle, I saw it. A cart. It was sitting in the middle of the floor, facing the back wall. No one was pushing it. The handle was slick with condensation, as if someone had just let go. A single item sat inside. A black plastic bag knotted tightly at the top. The bag shifted slightly, like something inside had moved. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed rooted. My eyes locked on that bag, waiting for it to twitch again, and then it did. I don't remember making the choice to run. One moment I was staring at that bag, my lungs locked tight, and the next I was halfway back to the register, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the hollow silence of the store. The cart never moved, but I swear I felt eyes follow me, heavy, unblinking, and patient. I grabbed my keys, dropped them, cursed, and snatched them up again with shaking hands. My body was on autopilot, every nerve screaming at me to get out. I didn't even bother turning off the lights or locking the register. I just sprinted for the glass doors and shoved my way outside, the night air rushing in like a tidal wave. But here's the thing. I could still hear the footsteps. Not outside, not behind me exactly, but in my head, like the sound had imprinted itself somewhere deeper. The drag, the pause, the drag again. Even as I got into my car, even as I fumbled the ignition and peeled out of the lot, the rhythm was there, a phantom sound stitched into the silence. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it had all been exhaustion, a glitching register, pipes settling in the walls. Maybe I'd even moved the cart earlier and forgotten, but the image of that bag twitching wouldn't leave me. I didn't imagine that. I couldn't have. Sleep that night was impossible. Every creak of my apartment felt like footsteps circling the bed. At one point, I swore I heard the soft squeak of a cartwheel in the hallway outside my door. I sat there in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for the sound to fade. It never did. It just stopped, like it wanted me to know it could. The next day, I drove past the store, convincing myself to quit, to tell my manager I couldn't do another night shift. But curiosity gnawed at me. Through the wide glass windows, I saw the cart, still in aisle 3, still holding that same black bag. I haven't gone back inside since. I too. LD my boss I was sick, then that I was quitting. He didn't argue. Part of me thinks he already knew. It's been weeks now. I avoid that stretch of road entirely, but sometimes when I'm walking through another store, Target, Walmart, anywhere, I'll catch sight of a cart pushed just slightly out of place. I'll freeze, my throat tight, waiting for a bag inside to shift. And sometimes I hear it again. That drag, that pause. That drag, like it's still following me, waiting.